7 minutes. One white police officer. An innocent black woman handcuffed in the middle of a crowded street. But when the entire courtroom believes she's the criminal, little do they know she's the governor's top legal advisor. Why was this truth hidden until the very last moment? The rain gently fell on the empty streets of suburban Atlanta, creating streaks of light reflecting from the headlights. Aria Thompson sat behind the wheel, the weight of exhaustion gradually pressing down on her body. Yet, there was a strange sense of peace in her heart. After a late-night session at the governor's office, where she had just presented significant proposals for judicial reform, all she wanted was to head home, lie down in her warm bed, and forget the tension of the entire day. The drafts she had just completed were the result of months of tireless work, carrying the hope of changing a justice system she knew all too well to be unfair, biased, and full of contradictions. But what no one knew was that as she drove home, the peace she felt was just an illusion. Because at that very moment, she was becoming the target of the very system she was trying to fix. The rain grew heavier, and distant thunder rumbled like a warning of the things to come. Aria leaned forward, trying to see through the streaks of water on the windshield, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, her life would be thrown into chaos, and a system she believed could be changed would immediately turn on her, pushing her down a path with no way out. The sound of a siren blared from behind her, a warning that made her heart race for a beat. But it wasn't out of fear. It was because she was used to this feeling, the sudden stops she could never be sure were intentional or just a routine check. Aria had no idea that in that moment, a long, challenging night would begin, and the fairness she had always fought for would be exchanged for an unexpected shock. The red and blue lights flashed behind her, the siren's wail cutting through the stillness of the rainy night. Aria glanced up in the rearview mirror, mildly surprised to see the patrol car pulling closer. She steered to the side of the road, slowly rolling down her window, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Just for a brief moment, an unsettling feeling crept over her. She reminded herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. Her documents were in order. She hadn't exceeded the speed limit, and she was definitely sober. Yet, her heart raced, not out of fear, but from a familiar feeling that had been ingrained in her mind. Her skin color, not her behavior, would be the first thing judged. Aria had lived long enough in a world filled with injustice and racial discrimination to understand that sometimes you do everything right, but your skin color decides whether you're treated as a criminal or not. Every time she was stopped like this, there was always a sense of worry, not out of fear, but because she knew things might be different if she were white. The officer stepped out of the patrol car, his gaze sharp as if prepared for a worst-case scenario. Aria quickly handed over her documents, saying nothing more. Her logic told her there was no need for concern, but deep down, she knew her vigilance wasn't unfounded. The officer didn't smile. He didn't greet her, but slowly walked toward the car, his hand already reaching for his notebook and pen. She tried to maintain a calm expression, but inside, a silent fear lingered, one she couldn't voice. He began asking her invasive questions, each one making her feel as though she were being judged from a place of inherent unfairness. "What are you doing here? Why are you out so late?" The questions were empty, but full of suspicion. Aria responded calmly, not wanting to escalate the situation. But with every word the officer spoke, she could feel the lack of respect. It seemed like he wasn't really interested in her answers, only in finding a reason to keep probing, to prove that she was not someone to be trusted. In those few brief seconds, Aria felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol car, the uncomfortable questions, and the officer's skeptical demeanor made her feel like a criminal. But Aria refused to let her anger show. She didn't want any of her actions to be interpreted as resisting or provoking. She just wanted to get through this stop peacefully, like all the others. But now, she had no idea that this would be the moment that changed everything. The officer stood there, his eyes fixed on Aria with an intensity that felt almost predatory. His questions came at her one after another, as though she owed him an explanation for every moment of her existence. "What are you doing here? Why are you out so late?" They were the same questions she had heard countless times, each one laden with suspicion and doubt, each one a reminder of the world she lived in. Aria didn't flinch. She had long ago learned how to mask the sting of these words. But tonight, something felt different. She could feel it in the air, heavy with tension, the storm brewing both outside and within her. She wasn't surprised by the questions. They were routine, part of the script that Black people had been forced to memorize. Ridiculous questions meant to unsettle and trap. But Arya knew something her body couldn't deny. The moment she was stopped, suspicion was already on her. No matter how many times she tried to convince herself she was innocent, the truth was clear. Her skin was the crime. She explained calmly, telling him about the meeting at the governor's office, the proposals for judicial reform she had been discussing, work that would change the very system he represented. But the officer's eyes never softened, and his posture never changed. It was as if he wasn't listening at all. His mind was already made up. A Black woman driving late at night in a city that wasn't hers to occupy was automatically suspicious. And then, just as Arya was about to breathe a sigh of relief, he spoke again. His voice was low, but the accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. "You smell like there's alcohol in the car." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation delivered without hesitation, without a single shred of evidence. The words hung in the air, thick with venom. A claim designed to take her down, to turn the tables and make her the problem. Arya's breath caught in her throat, her heart slamming in her chest as her body went cold. How could he say something so reckless? She had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant this kind of treatment. But here he was, creating a narrative, feeding into the false stereotypes that had haunted her all her life. Her mind raced, but the cold, sharp reality of the situation began to settle in. The officer wasn't just looking for evidence. He was looking for an excuse to accuse her. He wanted to catch her in a lie, to prove that she wasn't trustworthy, that she wasn't above suspicion. It didn't matter that she had been nothing but compliant, nothing but transparent. What mattered was that she was Black, and that, in his eyes, was reason enough to suspect guilt. Arya's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew she had the right to refuse, to assert her constitutional protections. She could challenge this, stand up for herself, but she also knew what that would cost her. The last time she had pushed back, she had ended up in a holding cell for hours, forced to prove her innocence when it was clear from the beginning she had done nothing wrong. She took a deep breath, and with the calmest voice she could muster, denied the accusation. "I haven't been drinking," she said firmly, looking him in the eye. But his gaze was unwavering. He wasn't listening to her, and he wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind. Without another word, the officer's demeanor shifted. He no longer looked like a man doing his job. He looked like a man with power, enjoying the opportunity to remind her of her place. His voice dropped, and the command was clear: "Open the door." There was no reason in his tone, no attempt to negotiate. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Arya's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a routine stop. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something far worse, a deliberate act to assert control over her, to remind her that in this system, she was never fully in control of her fate. Arya hesitated for just a moment, her mind racing with the consequences of every choice she made. She knew what would happen if she refused. She had seen it too many times: escalation, brutality, and the risk of it all turning against her. And so, despite every instinct screaming at her to stand her ground, to demand justice, she did what she had to do. She opened the door. The cold air hit her face as the officer pulled her out of the car, his hands rough as they yanked her arms behind her. She barely had time to register what was happening before she felt the metal bite into her wrists. The cuffs were tight, uncomfortably so, and the pressure only made her realize how little control she had over her own life. Her body froze in shock, her breath caught in her throat as the reality of the moment crashed over her. She had done everything right, everything by the book, and still, she was treated like a criminal. The officer said nothing as he shoved her toward the patrol car. There was no explanation, no apology, just the cold indifference of a system that had already decided her fate. Arya stood there, silent, humiliated, the sting of the cuffs on her wrist the only thing keeping her tethered to the present moment. And just like that, everything she had worked for, every reform, every sacrifice she had made in the name of justice, seemed a world away. She was no longer Arya Thompson, a dedicated legal advisor fighting for the future of a broken system. She was a black woman handcuffed in the middle of the street, at the mercy of a system that never intended to change. In that moment, she realized with painful clarity, no matter how many battles she fought, how many victories she won, there were forces far greater than her, and they had the power to strip everything away in an instant. The heavy slam of the iron door echoed in the small, suffocating room as it shut behind her, leaving Arya standing alone in the oppressive darkness. The air inside the cell felt thick with a stench of mold and stale sweat that clung to her skin like a second layer. The cold seeping through the concrete walls felt like it was gnawing at her bones, making her head spin. Above, the ceiling was a patchwork of dark, stained watermarks, evidence of years of neglect. The walls, peeling and chipped, were scrawled with crude, hateful messages etched by previous prisoners. Their desperation and rage were permanently seared into the structure. A single flickering light bulb dangled from the ceiling. Its sickly yellow glow did little to dispel the dark, only adding to the oppressive atmosphere that felt like it was closing in on her. The bench bolted to the wall smelled of old blood and cheap disinfectant, the kind that never quite covered the stench of decay. It was a place meant to dehumanize, to strip away dignity, and it did its job well. Arya sat down, her hands still stinging from the raw imprint left by the cold metal cuffs. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had sat in the same spot, trapped in this pit of despair. How many had been crushed under the weight of a system that never cared to ask whether they were innocent or not. She could still feel the lingering bite of those cuffs, the humiliation of being shackled like an animal. She wasn't allowed a phone call, not a single word to her lawyer. The guards hadn't even bothered to ask for her name properly, treating her as if she were just another faceless criminal. Every time she tried to speak, asking for legal representation, she was met with cold, indifferent stares, followed by cruel sneers. A lawyer? Who do you think you are? Everyone in here says they're innocent. You're not special. The words hit her like a slap across the face, their bitterness hanging in the air long after they had been spoken. Arya's chest tightened as she realized just how far beneath their contempt she had fallen. She, Arya Thompson, a highly respected legal advisor, a woman who had once sat across from Supreme Court judges, who had spent countless hours drafting bills for prison reform, was now nothing more than a nameless body locked away in this filthy, degrading hellhole. She sat still, the cold bench digging into her legs as her mind wandered. Her eyes fell on the wall in front of her, where a faint, dried handprint marred the surface. The blood, old and blackened, told a story she didn't need to hear. How many people had been forced into this godforsaken place, their names lost to time, their stories buried under the weight of the system? How many innocent people had been held here with no one to speak for them, no one to fight for their freedom? The walls, scarred and stained, were the only witnesses to their suffering, and Arya could almost hear their voices screaming in silence. The isolation was unbearable. There was no clock, no phone, no way to mark the passage of time. Arya felt the world slipping away, as if she had been cut off from everything she had ever known. No one cared about her rights. No one cared about her innocence. She was just another black woman trapped in a system built to grind her down. What would happen to someone like her, someone with power, with connections? If this could happen to her, someone with status, education, and influence, what about the countless others who had nothing to offer? What about the people who were crushed beneath the weight of this broken system before they even had a chance to speak? The silence of the cell was deafening, thick with the weight of her reality. It wasn't just the prison, the filth, or the cold that broke her. It was the truth that she, Arya Thompson, had been reduced to nothing more than a nameless prisoner. Her worth measured by nothing but the color of her skin. There was no justice here, no fairness, just an empty cell, and the cruel reminder that in this world, justice was something only some people got to experience. The next morning, Arya was escorted into the courtroom, her body drained after a sleepless night in that filthy cell. The harsh fluorescent light overhead flickered as it cast a cold, unforgiving glow on her face, where fatigue and anger were still deeply etched. Her suit, which she had worn the day before, was wrinkled beyond recognition, stained by the grime of the holding cell floor, a stark contrast to the polished, professional image she had always worked hard to maintain. Yet, despite everything, She held her head high as she entered courtroom 2C of the Fulton County Courthouse, a place where too many black individuals had come to refer to as the graveyard of hope. At the highest seat in the room, Judge Marcus Thorne sat with an air of icy indifference, his eyes skimming over the file that the clerk had just placed before him. He was no stranger to the local legal community, infamous for his severity, coldness, and especially his reputation for handing down harsh sentences to black defendants. Beneath that black robe, he was rumored to be a man more concerned with perpetuating prejudice than delivering true justice. When Aria Thompson's name was called, he didn't even lift his gaze from the file in front of him. His eyes flicked to the document for a moment before his voice, flat and devoid of any emotion, rang out. "Miss Thompson, you are charged with obstruction and interfering with an investigation. Do you have legal counsel?" Aria opened her mouth, her voice hoarse but firm. "Your Honor, I have not been permitted to make a phone call or contact anyone to obtain legal counsel." But before she could finish her sentence, Judge Thorne raised his hand, cutting her off with a sharp, dismissive glance. "I didn't ask you what you wanted to say. I asked if you have a legal representative." The abruptness, the coldness, the utter disregard for her rights. It wasn't just silence that filled the room. It was a deep, suffocating sense of being invisible. No one came to her defense. No one stepped in to protect her fundamental rights, the right to an attorney, the right to present her case. She fought to remain calm, her hands trembling slightly as she added, "I am a lawyer, and I can represent myself if permitted." But Judge Thorne didn't flinch, nor did he acknowledge her qualifications. He simply shook his head, his tone laced with mockery and disdain. "A lawyer? Right now, you're a defendant, not a colleague." He waved the officer beside her back, then turned to the court clerk, speaking in a final, cutting tone. "Note in the record, no legal representation. Proceed." The air in the courtroom was thick, suffocating, as if a glass wall had risen between Aria and the rest of the world. Each word, each action from the judge was like a strike to her dignity. She, a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice, now stood before the very system she had once believed in, reduced to nothing more than a nameless defendant unworthy of even the most basic protections. The law, which she had once trusted to be the last bastion of fairness, now stood as the very tool that stripped her of her identity. Today, in front of everyone, she was being treated as a person without value, without a voice, unworthy of being heard. Without asking a single further question, without giving Aria a chance to explain herself, Judge Marcus Thorne sat back in his chair, his posture stiff and rigid, his hands steepled in front of him as if conducting an evaluation of a mere object rather than a person. His voice, cold and clinical, sliced through the tense air of the courtroom. "Considering the defendant's refusal to cooperate with law enforcement and actions obstructing the investigation, this court finds the defendant to be a potential threat to the community." The words hit Aria with the force of a physical blow. She felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. There was no evidence presented, no tangible proof, no corroborating witnesses, just a report from the same officer who had handcuffed her the night before. That was the sole basis for this accusation. And yet here she was, a senior legal advisor to the governor, a woman who had dedicated her life to advocating for justice, now being labeled a threat in the very space that was supposed to embody justice and fairness. Judge Thorne barely glanced up as he delivered his ruling, flipping through the papers in front of him as if he were deciding the fate of a trivial matter. "Bail is set at $10,000, he announced flatly. Aria's body tensed as the words settled in, a laughably high number, an amount that was both unjust and unreasonable for a charge that had no merit. Aria's fists clenched, her blood boiling with indignation. She had a steady job, a clean record, a legal license, and had never once been involved in any criminal activity. She was the last person who should have been subjected to this level of injustice. Under normal circumstances, bail set for this type of accusation, if there was even any basis for it, would have been a few $100s or even a release on her own recognizance. But here, in this cold, sterile courtroom, justice was reserved for a select few, and Aria was clearly not one of them. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she had to fight the urge to lash out, to let the fury that was boiling inside her spill over. She could feel the tears of frustration threatening to rise. but she willed herself to hold them back. She couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not in front of this man who had already decided her fate. But it was hard, so hard, when all she wanted to do was scream. To tell them all that she was more than this, more than a black woman in the system, more than a suspect or a threat. She had spent her life building a career on the foundations of justice and integrity. And yet here she was, treated like a criminal with no voice, no rights, no humanity. Before she could even begin to process the injustice of the moment, the officer beside her stepped forward, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. The touch was a physical reminder of the role she now played. The prisoner, the defendant, the person who no longer mattered. The officer pulled her toward the door, his grip tight, as though she might escape if given the chance. Arya tried to remain composed, but every step she took felt heavier than the last. Each movement, each shift in her posture, was another blow to her sense of self-worth, another cruel reminder that she was being reduced to nothing more than a statistic in a system designed to break her. As she walked out of the courtroom, Arya could feel the eyes of the people in the gallery boring into her. The whispers were loud enough to reach her, the judgment seeping through the air like poison. She caught sight of a few faces, their expressions filled with skepticism, their eyes narrowed with contempt. They didn't know her. They didn't know that she had sat at tables with powerful lawmakers, advocating for policies to protect marginalized communities. They didn't know that she had worked tirelessly to fight systemic injustice. They didn't know that just the night before, she had been in the governor's office drafting bills aimed at reforming a broken system. But none of that mattered. None of it mattered because they saw her as nothing more than a black woman in a courtroom, a woman they would never bother to understand, a woman who wasn't worth listening to. Their gaze told her everything she needed to know. She was invisible, dismissed, erased. As Arya was led out of the courtroom, the weight of the injustice began to settle heavily on her chest. She could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists, the sharp edges of the system that had just condemned her. The door to the courtroom swung open, and she stepped into the hall, her head lowered, her body aching with the burden of what had just happened. It wasn't just the fact that she was being detained. It wasn't even the unfair bail. It was the fact that she, Arya Thompson, had been stripped of her dignity in front of everyone. She had been reduced to nothing more than an accused criminal, with no respect, no compassion, no acknowledgement of her humanity. The truth was clear now. She wasn't being judged for the accusations against her. She wasn't being judged for the so-called crime she was supposedly involved in. She was being judged for daring to exist in a system that had always been stacked against people like her, a black woman who had the audacity to speak up and demand change. She had fought her whole life for a justice system that didn't exist for people like her. And now that very system was crushing her with every callous word, every biased decision, every dehumanizing moment. As she was escorted away, Arya realized that her battle had just begun. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. But for now, as she walked down the corridor, she understood the bitter reality that the system was far from being what it was meant to be, a place of justice, of fairness. Instead, it had become a machine that chewed up and spat out people like her, people who dared to challenge the very foundations it was built on. The heavy door of the detention center clicked shut behind Arya with a cold finality, as though marking the end of a nightmare she hadn't fully woken from. She stood frozen for a few seconds under the overcast sky, the wind whipping through her tangled hair, her exhausted shoulders trembling ever so slightly. The white shirt she had worn for the past 2 nights was now stained and wrinkled, and her once sharp, confident eyes now held a hint of despair, though the fire within them had not yet dimmed. Arya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the shame of it all lingered in every step she took. She had no idea who had posted her bail. It wasn't until she stepped off the curb that she saw 2 figures waiting for her by the SUV parked across the street. Elena Rossi, her thick brown hair pulled into a high bun, her sharp features and a gaze that sparkled with fire, hurried forward and wrapped Arya in a tight embrace. No words needed. Behind her stood Daniel Sterling, the governor's deputy chief of staff, impeccably dressed in a sharp blue suit, but his face was pale, twisted in barely contained fury. They didn't need to ask many questions. The moment they saw Arya, the weariness in her face, the trace of humiliation in her eyes, they understood. The frantic phone call had only scratched the surface of the nightmare. "This is insane." Elena spat, her eyes burning with anger. "You got arrested for refusing a car search? No warrant, no reason, no explanation?" Daniel fell silent, his hand landing heavily on Aria's shoulder. "They're hunting you. Someone wants to destroy your reputation and your influence. The word is already spreading through the halls of government, but no one expected it to be this bad." Aria nodded slightly, her voice thick with exhaustion. "They don't need evidence. They just need an excuse. And if it wasn't me that day, it would have been someone else to take the fall." Elena gripped her hand tighter, her gaze fierce. "And that's why we won't let this slide. You're not alone in this, Aria." In the suffocating silence that followed, the presence of her two longtime friends felt like a warm breeze cutting through the cold, dark reality she was facing. In their eyes, she saw the anger, the protectiveness, and most importantly, the silent vow that justice would be fought for, not only for Aria, but for all those who had ever been crushed under the weight of this broken system. The battle was only just beginning. In the small conference room of Elena Rossi's law office, Rossi and partners, the three of them sat around a dark wooden table. The warm yellow light from the overhead lamp cast a soft glow on the scattered files, papers, laptops, and hastily scribbled notes. The air in the room felt as heavy as lead. No jokes, no laughter, just the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Aria silently read through a preliminary report that Elena had just printed out, her eyes fixed on the title, "Internal Complaint Against Officer Leo Vance." The numbers made her stomach twist. Eight official complaints of racial discrimination spanning the past 4 years. From unjustified traffic stops and warrantless searches to using offensive language toward black individuals, and not a single case had been independently investigated. Elena stressed each word as she spoke. No disciplinary action, no transfer request, all of it swept under the rug due to lack of evidence. Daniel, disheartened, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Because the cameras are always broken, or data is missing, right?" Elena nodded, flipping to another file. This time, it was a collection of recent cases tried by Judge Marcus Thorne. "We found at least 27 similar cases over the past 2 years where he handed down sentences at least 1.5, sometimes twice the average penalty. Yet, the common denominator is that all the victims are black." She handed Aria a stack of documents which included names, dates, the defendant's statements, and the testimonies that were ignored. Aria flipped through the pages, her vision blurring with anger. She placed the file down with a heavy thud, her voice low but sharp as a knife. "This is no longer a case of mistaken identity. This is a system that is operating with intent. The police arrest, the court judges, and then they wash their hands of it like nothing ever happened." Daniel nodded grimly, his face hardening. "We're looking at an undercurrent of power where skin color determines your fate. And if you weren't Aria Thompson, the governor's legal advisor, they would have buried you without a trace." Silence settled over them for a few seconds before Elena spoke decisively. "We need to expose this, not just to protect Aria, but to drag this entire system out of the shadows." And in that moment, the three of them understood the battle ahead would not just be for justice for one individual. It would be to pierce through a system of discrimination that had been shielded by law and silence. That afternoon, in the Rossi and Partners law office, the air was no longer thick with anger and frustration. Instead, it had transformed into something palpable, something powerful: determination. Aria sat quietly, her hand wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, her eyes staring out through the glass window at the fading daylight that bathed the red brick buildings of downtown Atlanta. She said nothing, but both Daniel and Elena understood. She was ready. Elena stood up abruptly, slamming a thick stack of documents down on the table, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. "We won't wait any longer," she declared, her voice firm and resolute. "I'm filing the lawsuit, not just to clear Aria's name, but to expose the system that has knowingly closed its eyes, ears, and shackled innocent people for years." Aria turned, her eyes no longer filled with doubt or exhaustion like they were that morning, but instead with a quiet fire that was beginning to burn. "He thought I would stay silent," she said softly. "He thought I would disappear in silence, like the others he pushed aside." She looked directly at Daniel. But he was wrong. Daniel, the usually quiet one, nodded slowly. He placed a document on the table, a list of state lawmakers he had contacted earlier that morning. I'll start lobbying. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you from any backlash from the court or the sheriff. If needed, I'll bring this to the governor's office. The three of them understood the cost. Suing a police officer who had buried his record for years wouldn't be easy. Confronting a judge with a firm position in the judicial system would be even harder. But if they didn't do it, who would? If Arya, someone who had once trusted in the law, was being crushed by the very system she had fought for, what chance did the average person, voiceless and powerless, have of being heard? The battle began here, not just to demand justice for one person wronged, but to shatter the toxic silence that had cloaked hundreds, even thousands, of trials where justice had been warped by bias and power. Arya looked at Elena and Daniel, a tired but unyielding smile creeping onto her lips. If we do this, she said, we can't back down. Elena responded without hesitation. I wasn't born to back down. Daniel clenched the documents in his hand, his voice steady and firm. And I'll make sure those politicians don't turn their backs on us. In that moment, the three of them, one lawyer, one political advisor, and one victim of injustice, became a team for justice, ready to fight a battle that the power structure had never imagined would be challenged. But this time, the game had changed. Just 3 days after Elena filed the lawsuit, a response from the Atlanta Police Department arrived at her office. The letter responding to the request for video evidence from the night Arya was arrested was neatly contained on a single page. Surprisingly brief, no excerpts, no detailed explanations, just one sentence. The dash cam and body cam from that shift experienced technical failure. No data available. Elena threw the printed letter onto the table, her gaze darkening with barely contained anger. Arya sat across from her, clenching her fists. Daniel, who had just entered the meeting room with his phone still warm from a recent call, almost shouted, "Is this the same old story again?" The connection between what had just happened and the suspicions Elena had held for so long was clearer than ever. While Arya struggled to keep her composure, Elena opened her laptop, pulling up a spreadsheet that she and her associates had compiled over the past night. She turned the screen towards her two friends. 12 cases spanning the last 3 years, all sharing a common thread. Every time they report a video loss, Elena said, pointing to each row, it's connected to the same person, Officer Leo Vance. There were complaints about unexpected traffic stops, accusations of being shoved to the ground without reason. Some people even claimed to have been locked up for the night without being interrogated. And in every single one of those cases, when requests for visual evidence were made, the police always responded the same. The equipment malfunctioned. Arya sat still, her back pressed against the chair, an icy chill running down her spine. She had once thought her arrest, her humiliation, and the way she had been treated like a criminal was a personal nightmare. But now the pieces were starting to fall into place, and the horrifying truth was worse than she had imagined. She wasn't alone in being denied evidence. She was just the next victim in a long line of people buried in silence by a deliberately orchestrated pattern of behavior. Daniel leaned over to study the data, then quietly muttered, "How many times has he done this because he knows no one can touch him?" Elena nodded, her eyes burning with fury. "And now we will touch him. Not just for Arya, but for all 12 of these people and anyone else who's been erased with the words, 'The video was corrupted.'" She turned to Arya, her voice slow but resolute. "He thought you would break when you were isolated. But now he doesn't know that you'll be the one to ignite the truth of this entire system." Arya said nothing, only nodded. Her gaze, for the first time in days, no longer veiled with pain, only fire and steel. That night, Elena's office was eerily quiet. Only Arya sat alone under the soft yellow glow of the desk lamp, surrounded by a stack of thick files that Elena had gathered from cases involving Officer Vance. Each page unfolded like a sigh from the past, telling the stories of lives crushed in silence. People with no titles, no connections, no voice. She stopped at the first file. Gregory Hayes, 42 years old, arrested for failing to signal a left turn onto a side street. According to the report, he showed attitude when pulled over and made threatening gestures. But there was no camera footage to verify what had happened. The result: Gregory was beaten to the point of hospitalization, then charged with assaulting an officer and sentenced to 3 months probation, along with a fine of nearly $4,000. No lawyer, no one to defend him. All he had was a statement no one believed and a conviction he couldn't appeal because he pled guilty under plea deal pressure. Next page. Linda Carter, 31 years old, a single mother of 2, summoned to court for disturbing the peace after arguing with an officer in a supermarket parking lot. The notes in her file read, "Spoke too loudly. Aggressive hand gestures." She received a fine but was unable to pay it right away. This led to a summons, then to a light sentence. 3 months later, she lost her job because she couldn't get to work due to the new criminal record. No one knew her. No one wrote about her. She was just another forgotten name buried among hundreds of quietly settled cases. Arya leaned back in her chair, her hand trembling slightly. These stories weren't new to her. She had seen them in statistics, heard them briefly mentioned in reform meetings, but now each person, each face, each helpless silence in these files stood out vividly and painfully before her. They had no lawyers. They didn't have Daniel. They didn't have Elena. And most importantly, they didn't have the luck of surviving the system they trusted. Arya's eyes blazed. She knew she couldn't change the past for them. But there was one thing she could do: stop it from happening again. They weren't the system's mistakes. They were the consequences of a system designed to push them aside. And if her case could shine a light on these dust-covered files, then that was what she had to do. Not just to restore her own dignity, but to give every forgotten person a voice, even if it was too late. That morning, just as Arya stepped into Elena's office, the phone rang incessantly. A young staff member rushed over, whispering something in Elena's ear, and immediately her face shifted. "There's a woman. She says she has video," Elena said, her eyes shifting towards Arya, a mix of surprise and suspicion. "She wants to meet in person." She claims she witnessed the arrest that night. Less than an hour later, in the third-floor conference room, a woman in her early 50s walked in, her thin frame draped in a worn khaki coat, carrying an old, faded cloth bag. Her name was Clara Jenkins, a night shift janitor who lived in a neighborhood near where Arya had been pulled over. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I didn't know who you were until I saw the news." She pulled out an old phone, its screen cracked at the corner. "I managed to record part of it when the police dragged you out of the car. At the time, I thought it was best to stay out of other people's business, but after seeing you falsely accused on TV, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Arya was speechless. Clara nervously pressed play on the video. A short but clear clip, filmed from behind some bushes, showed Arya being handcuffed while completely cooperative. No signs of resistance. Officer Vance's voice rang out in the video, loud and condescending. "You've got an attitude. Smells like booze in the car," while Arya only responded with one sentence. "I haven't been drinking. I know my rights." The atmosphere in the room became suffocating. Elena looked at Arya, then turned to Clara, her eyes moist. "You know that going public with this could get you into trouble, right?" Clara nodded, but her gaze was unwavering. "I'm poor. I don't have a lawyer or connections like you, but I still have my conscience. If this can happen to you, someone like you, then who's going to believe people like me?" Her words made the room fall silent. Arya moved closer, taking Clara's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not alone. No one will be silenced anymore." It was the first time in days that real belief rose up in Arya. Not from political offices, not from numbers or lawyers, but from an ordinary woman who had dared to stand up for justice. And it was Clara, someone with no power, no status, who did what the entire system had avoided. She spoke out. And now, with evidence in hand, the story was no longer just words against words. The truth now had images, sound, and a witness. And it was beginning to break down the wall of lies. The courtroom that morning was suffocatingly still, a heavy silence hanging over it like a shroud. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustling of papers as the clerk flipped through the case files. Arya sat in her seat, her body rigid, her eyes fixed firmly on the witness stand. Officer Leo Vance stood there, dressed in his crisp, perfectly pressed uniform, the gleaming medals on his chest a shining, hollow display of authority. He spoke in a voice that was steady and rehearsed, as though each word was an actor's line he had practiced for years. She was aggressive from the start. There was a strong smell of alcohol in the car. When I asked her to cooperate, She not only refused but also became threatening. Every word from his lips felt like a razor slashing through Aria's heart. But it wasn't the fear of him that cut her. It was the sheer ease with which he lied, the certainty with which he spun his version of the truth. The smoothness of his lies seemed to float in the air, unchallenged, untouched, while the silence in the courtroom smothered any chance of her voice being heard. No objections, no one demanding evidence, no one questioning his words. He was simply performing a role he had perfected over the years, one the system had allowed to run unchecked time and time again. Aria's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't angry at him. Not at this moment. What tore at her was a deeper, more painful feeling, disillusionment. She had once believed in the law, in the courts, in the idea that if you followed the rules and fought for fairness, you would eventually be heard. She had worked tirelessly, fought for justice, and trusted in a system that she had been told was meant to protect the innocent. But now, as she watched Vance speak without hesitation, knowing that his lies would be swallowed whole by this courtroom, she understood the truth she had long ignored. The system didn't need to strike her down with violence. It could crush her with silence. And that silence, that indifference, was more suffocating than any physical blow. Tears welled in Aria's eyes, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. They rolled down her cheeks, not just for the injustice she had suffered, but for every person who had ever been forced to sit in her seat. The countless individuals whose voices had been drowned out by lies and deceit. The people who had been discarded by a system that was supposed to protect them, but instead had failed them at every turn. And when her eyes met Officer Vance's, he didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He knew the lies he spoke would be protected, that the system would shield him no matter how false his words were. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the system that had always had his back. But in that moment, Aria felt a deep, quiet strength stir inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced by the weight of the system, about every single person who had been forced to accept injustice simply because they didn't have the power to fight back. She wasn't just sitting in that courtroom for her own sake. She was sitting there for all of them. She knew now, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that the truth would come out. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about showing the world that even the smallest voice, when fueled by truth, could break through the walls of indifference that had built up around her for so long. As she looked at Vance, something shifted. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was the realization that the truth, though delayed, would eventually break free. The silence they had used to protect their lies would no longer be enough to keep the truth hidden. The tears that had fallen down her face were not a sign of defeat, but a testament to the resilience she still carried. They may have thought she would cower in silence, that she would disappear like so many others before her. But they were wrong. Aria was ready to speak, to stand tall, and to shatter the silence that had allowed the lies to persist. The truth had a voice now, and it was stronger than ever. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically as Elena stood up, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, we would like to call our second witness, Miss Clara Jenkins." All eyes turned toward the back of the room where Clara, a small woman with a slight hunch to her step, made her way to the witness stand. She wasn't dressed in fine clothes, nor did she have the air of someone in power. But with every step she took, there was a quiet courage that no lawyer or politician could ever replicate. When sworn in, Clara gave a small nod before beginning to speak. "I was about 20 meters away, waiting for my car to go home after my night shift. I saw the police car block off Miss Thompson's car. She wasn't yelling or resisting. On the contrary, it was the officer who was loud and aggressive. I felt something was wrong, so I turned on my phone and recorded a video." Elena nodded to the court clerk. "We would like to submit the video evidence, Your Honor." The lights dimmed as a large screen lowered. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. The video appeared on the screen. Short, just over a minute long, but enough to completely unravel the performance Officer Vance had just staged. In the video, Aria is seen sitting in her car, both hands resting on the steering wheel, her calm voice filling the room. "I haven't violated anything. I don't consent to a search without a warrant." In contrast, Vance is seen shouting angrily, stepping close to the window with hostility. "Who do you think you are? Open the door. You're resisting." And then the video cuts off at the moment he grabs Aria's arm, yanking her out of the car like a dangerous criminal, while she made no attempt to resist. The courtroom felt deathly silent. No one spoke. There was no longer any confidence in Officer Vance's eyes. His face stiffened, his breath catching as if he had just watched the damning evidence against him for the first time. Some of the spectators in the gallery exchanged glances, whispering. A court clerk covered her mouth. Even Judge Marcus Thorne, who had maintained an air of coldness throughout the trial, sat up straighter, his gaze sharp as he stared at the screen in disbelief. Arya didn't look up. She simply closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Not in triumph, but because at last, the truth had found its voice. No one had to shout. No arguments needed to be made. The images spoke for everything. And that moment, brief yet powerful, shook the very foundation of the courtroom, which had long been a fortress of injustice. When the video ended, the lights in the courtroom flickered back on. But that light could not dispel the heavy silence that hung in the air. It was as though time had stopped, and everyone was waiting for something. A spark of justice, a word that would turn the tide in such a way that it could no longer be denied. Elena stood tall, her eyes locked on Judge Marcus Thorne's chair. "Your Honor," she said firmly. "The evidence clearly shows the defendant was neither aggressive nor resistant. We motion to dismiss all charges based on the false information provided by the police witness." Arya said nothing. She remained seated, her hands tightly clasped, her gaze focused on Judge Thorne, hoping, just this once, that he would not turn away from the truth. But as the judge leaned back in his chair, his cold, emotionless eyes locking onto the room, Arya saw the one thing she feared most. He wasn't going to change. Judge Thorne spoke slowly, almost evasively. "The video only records a brief portion of the event. The sound is unclear. It doesn't present the full context. It is not legally sufficient to completely invalidate the testimony of an officer in the line of duty." He paused, scanning the room with a face that betrayed no feeling. "The court does not find sufficient grounds to dismiss the case. The trial will proceed next week." Not a word about the lies, not a question about the abuse of power, no acknowledgement of the injustice standing plainly before them. Arya felt as if the entire room had collapsed beneath her feet. People in the gallery began to murmur, not in surprise, but in outrage. A few muttered, "This is ridiculous," from the back rows. Daniel, seated behind her, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Elena turned to look at Arya, her eyes blazing with intensity. "He's trying to protect the system's mask, but it's cracked now. We just need one more push." Arya rose slowly and with quiet dignity. Though her heart was storming with fury, her face remained composed. As she was silently escorted out of the courtroom, she understood one thing clearly. This was no longer just a trial. It was a battle between what is right and a decaying system that was fighting against the very justice it once swore to protect. She was not exonerated today, but the entire courtroom saw. The entire world saw. And this time, they could not pretend they didn't know. Amid what seemed like a deadlock on a gloomy afternoon in Elena's office, the phone rang with an unusually sharp tone. The caller was Simon Croft, a digital forensic investigator hired in secret to track down the lost data. His voice was urgent but firm. "You two need to come to the lab right now. We found something important." Arya and Elena rushed to the digital facility located in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. There, on a secondary server screen usually only used for backups during critical system updates, a dashcam video that hadn't been deleted appeared. It was rough, flickering, but undeniably clear. The footage showed Arya pulling over. Her voice, calm and polite, echoed in the clip. "I haven't violated anything. I don't consent to a search without a warrant." In contrast, Officer Vance, seemingly aware that he wasn't being monitored, twisted the narrative, rummaging through her car while calling in. "The subject isn't cooperating," showing attitude. "I suspect there's alcohol in the car." Arya froze when she heard those words again. This time not from Vance's mouth, but from the radio transmission recorded in the still night air. A lie pulled from thin air, spoken as if the truth didn't matter, only convincing the person on the other end of the line. Simon nodded, his expression grim. "This video has never been tampered with. It's the raw, original data. This is a copy from the secondary server, saved temporarily while the main system was updating. And now, it's the smoking gun, the bullet that exposes the entire lie." Elena didn't hesitate for a second. The very next day, she held a press conference, publicly releasing the video. The media erupted. Every major news channel aired the same breaking story. Dashcam video disproves all charges against Aria Thompson, Officer Vance suspected of perjury. On social media, the hashtag Justice for Aria became a trending topic. But what shocked everyone more than the viral video was Governor Samuel Price's official appearance before the press, standing beside Aria and declaring to hundreds of reporters, "A justice system only has value when it protects both the vulnerable and the powerful. And when those within the system are crushed by it, we must act. I stand with Ms. Thompson, and I stand with the truth." That statement hit like thunder in a storm. The district attorney's office was forced to speak out. The State Judicial Council demanded a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Judge Thorne over the past 10 years. Forgotten names like Gregory Hayes, Linda Carter were now brought up in the news as symbols of the cruelty silence had caused. The system began to crack from within, and Aria, the one who had once been a victim, had now become the torch that was causing the cold, fortified walls to crumble. The Fulton County Courthouse was packed on the day of the final ruling. The crowd spilled out into the hallways, all the way to the steps outside. When the new trial judge, Judge Evelyn Reed, ascended to the bench, the atmosphere in the room became suffocatingly tense. After reviewing all the evidence, the original video copy, the testimony of the investigator, Clara's witness account, and a series of facts revealing systemic misconduct, she spoke just one sentence. The defendant, Aria Thompson, is acquitted. All charges are completely dismissed. The courtroom erupted in applause and sighs of relief, the tension finally breaking. Aria embraced Elena tightly. Daniel leaped from his seat, his eyes red. But it didn't stop there. Sophia, the legal representative filling in for Elena during the trial, stood up to present the next motion. "We demand a criminal investigation into Officer Leo Vance for perjury, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. We also ask the State Judicial Council to review the bias, obstruction of justice, and refusal to recuse himself of Judge Marcus Thorne." This time, no one could ignore the motion. No more silence, no more cover-ups. The whirlwind of truth had dragged both Vance and Thorne into the light, and there was nowhere for them to hide. Aria stood up, her eyes filled with tears, but her back straight, her voice clear and resolute. "Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. And I didn't fight alone." The crowd outside the courthouse cheered her name. Those who had once been afraid now had faith. The truth, at last, had triumphed, and justice, after being suffocated for so long, had burst back into flames. Less than 2 weeks after the historic trial, the Atlanta Police Department issued an official statement. Officer Leo Vance was placed on indefinite suspension, facing a criminal investigation by the Georgia State Internal Affairs Division. Media outlets across the country ran images of him leaving the station. No longer with his arrogant demeanor, no longer cloaked in the fabricated glory of his uniform or medals. He was just a man with his head bowed, avoiding the cameras, walking in a humiliation that no words could erase. Those who had once been silent out of fear, those he had threatened, began to speak. And this time, no one could silence them. At the same time, Judge Marcus Thorne, the man who had sat at the highest seat in the courtroom, coldly destroying countless lives, quietly submitted his resignation. No apology, no press conference, just a piece of paper placed on the desk of the chairman of the State Judicial Council. But the public didn't need his words. His honor had shattered, piece by piece, before the eyes of the nation. Old files, cases that had been twisted by his biased and callous rulings, were now reopened like bleeding wounds, seen for the first time and called by their rightful names. When Aria returned to the governor's office, employees lined the hallways, not as part of the usual protocol, but out of respect. She didn't walk back in as a victim, but as a survivor carrying the torch of reform. On her desk lay the same drafts of laws she had once written and edited quietly. Proposals for police behavior control, the creation of an independent judicial oversight mechanism, and a mandate for the mandatory storage of all law enforcement video footage. These documents, once dismissed, now sat on the legislative table with overwhelming public support. Governor Samuel Price referred to Aria as the heart and mind of this reform. But Aria didn't accept that credit for herself. In a live interview on national television, she simply said, I'm just one of many who've been silenced. I had the chance to survive, to speak, so I must speak for those who no longer have that chance. With that simple presence, that unwavering gaze, and that one line, Aria Thompson became the living symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. Not through shouting or grand speeches, but through her very wounds and victories. The aftershock of Aria's case didn't stay confined within the boundaries of one state. Media outlets across the country began to dig into hundreds of cases that had been hastily convicted or dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence that in reality was a result of sheer neglect. Dozens of cases were reopened, and many victims once unjustly imprisoned were now released and had their reputations restored after years spent in the shadows. At a legal support center established by Aria and Elena, more people came in every day, sharing their stories. An elderly man, 60 years old, charged for picking up a knife in a park. A young woman dragged out of a restaurant simply for not dressing the right way. Every story, every voice, became a part of the new anthem that Aria was writing. A society where pain can no longer be hidden by silence. At a ceremony honoring those who contributed to the wave of reform, Aria stood before thousands, her voice clear and filled with emotion. Silence was once the easiest choice. But today, I want to say to everyone who has been wronged, who has been buried in silence, silence is no longer an option. Now we can speak. And when enough people speak up, the entire system will have to listen. The crowd erupted in applause. Tears, smiles, tight embraces, everything mixed together in that moment. Because Aria's story wasn't just about justice for one person. It was the wake-up call for an entire nation that had slept too long in the face of injustice. And from that moment on, no one would remain invisible anymore. Thank you for watching this powerful story of courage, injustice, and redemption. If Aria's journey stirred something deep within you, if it made you feel anger, hope, or a renewed sense of purpose, then know this: you are not alone. Every time a voice rises against silence, another wall of injustice begins to crack. Here on Emotional Journey, we don't just tell stories for entertainment. We bring truth to light and honor those who've been ignored, silenced, or broken by systems meant to protect them. These stories aren't fiction. They echo the realities faced by too many around us. And if they moved you, it means your heart is part of the change we desperately need. That's why your presence here matters. So, if you believe in justice, in standing up for the voiceless, in rewriting what it means to fight for what's right, please subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, your pain, your hope. Together, we can grow this community of truth seekers and light bearers. Your support helps us continue to bring powerful, emotional stories to the world. We're just getting started.